It was the summer of 1835, and the world, for a boy of 10 years, was suddenly confined to the ancient, whispering walls of the Chateau Valois. Our journey from the bustling, sun-drenched streets of Paris to this isolated estate in the Loire Valley had been swift, almost brutal in its suddenness. Papa, usually so robust and full of laughter, had received news that flattened him like a felled oak. He spoke in hushed, strained tones to Maman about unforeseen circumstances and the necessity of retreat. All I understood was that we were leaving our grand townhouse, my beloved wooden soldier collection, and the familiar faces of our neighborhood for a place I had only ever seen in Papa's dusty, forgotten maps. Chateau Valois was not merely old. It felt like time itself had grown weary within its stone embrace. Its gray facade, scarred by centuries of wind and rain, loomed over us on the day we arrived, casting a long, skeletal shadow across the overgrown drive. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, wrestled with the crumbling stone and ancient oak trees. Gnarled and heavy with age, stood like silent sentinels guarding its secrets. The air itself was different here, heavier, laden with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, something metallic, like old coins or forgotten blood. I shivered, though the summer sun was still high. My sister, Elise, 2 years my junior, clung to Maman's skirts, her usually bright eyes wide with apprehension. She was always more sensitive than I, more attuned to the unseen currents of the world. The interior was a labyrinth of echoing halls and cavernous rooms, each colder and darker than the last. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light that pierced the grime-coated windows, swirling like tiny, desperate spirits. The furniture, draped in white sheets, resembled a graveyard of forgotten giants. Our footsteps, usually so light, seemed to boom and reverberate, amplified by the oppressive silence. It was a silence unlike any I had ever known, not the quiet of a sleeping house, but the hushed stillness of a place holding its breath, waiting. Papa, surprisingly, seemed to find a grim solace in this desolation. He spent his days in the cavernous library, poring over heavy, leather-bound tomes, his brow perpetually furrowed. Maman, ever practical, began the arduous task of bringing life back to the grand, neglected spaces, her determination a small, steady flame against the Manor's chill. Elise, after an initial period of quiet observation, found joy in the neglected gardens, where wild roses bloomed in untamed profusion, their thorns catching on her dresses as she chased butterflies. But I, young Jacques, found myself drawn to the house itself, a fascination born of both fear and curiosity. It was too vast, too silent, too full of shadows to simply be a dwelling. It felt alive, in a strange, ancient way. And then, one rainy afternoon, it began. I was exploring the long gallery on the second floor, a room lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow my every move. The rain lashed against the tall windows, and the wind moaned through the ill-fitting sashes. It was then, amidst the general creaking and groaning of the old house, that I heard it, a sound so faint, so fleeting, that I questioned if it was merely my imagination. It was like a whisper, soft and indistinct, coming not from the wind, but from the very walls themselves. I pressed my ear against the cold, plastered surface, holding my breath. Nothing. Only the drumming rain. I moved along the wall, my fingers, trailing over the flaking paint, until I reached a section where the plaster seemed to bulge slightly, as if something were trapped beneath it. I leaned in again, and this time, there it was, clearer, though still tantalizingly vague. It sounded like voices, hushed and urgent, murmuring just beyond my reach. I couldn't make out words, only a cadence, a rise and fall as if someone were speaking in low tones, confiding a secret. My heart hammered against my ribs. Was the house truly haunted? Had the whispers of generations past somehow become embedded in the stone and mortar? I thought of the village tales whispered by our new housekeeper, Madame Dubois, about the tragedy of Valois, a story she always cut short with a nervous glance over her shoulder. The previous owners, she'd hinted, had met an unfortunate end, though she refused to elaborate, crossing herself swiftly. I spent the next few days testing my theory. I would wander the halls, particularly the older wings, pausing often, straining my ears. Sometimes there was nothing but the usual creaks and groans of a settling house. Other times, the whispers would return, a faint, ethereal symphony of unseen voices, like distant echoes caught in a perpetual loop. They were never loud enough to distinguish words, never distinct enough to identify a speaker. It was always just a hum, a low thrumming of voices, as if many people were speaking at once, just on the other side of an impossibly thick barrier. I tried to tell Elise, but she merely giggled, preoccupied with a beetle she'd found. "The house is just old, Jacques," she'd said, dismissing my growing dread. "It makes noises." Maman and Papa were far too engrossed in their own anxieties to notice my pale face or my sudden habit of pressing my ear to the walls. Papa was often irritable, his temper frayed by the financial woes he now faced, and Maman was busy managing the meager staff and making the manor habitable. I was left alone with my unsettling discovery. The whispers seemed to grow bolder with each passing day, or perhaps it was just my own perception sharpening. They became more frequent, more insistent. Sometimes they almost seemed to follow me. I would be in the grand dining room, polishing an antique silver spoon for Maman, and I would hear them, faint but undeniable, from the wall behind the imposing fireplace. Then, when I moved to the staircase, they would shift, as if moving with me, echoing from the balustrade. It was unsettling, to say the least. I began to feel as though I was not alone, that unseen presences shared the vast cold space with me, sharing secrets that I, a mere boy, was not meant to overhear. My sleep became disturbed. I would lie awake in my large, unfamiliar bed, listening to the incessant chirping of crickets outside and the rhythmic tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall. But beneath these familiar nocturnal sounds, I would strain to hear the other, stranger sounds. Sometimes, a particularly strong gust of wind would make the entire house groan, and for a moment the whispers would intensify, sounding almost like a collective sigh or a chorus of hushed complaints. It was then that true fear would grip me, a cold hand squeezing my heart. What if the previous occupants hadn't truly left? What if their very essence, their final desperate pleas or bitter laments, had become woven into the fabric of the manor itself? I started carrying a small, flickering candle with me when I explored, even during the day, as if its meager flame could ward off the encroaching shadows and the unseen things that lurked within the walls. I found myself speaking less, listening more, always attuned to the faint, ethereal symphony that seemed to be the manor's very heartbeat. The grandeur of the Chateau Valois no longer held any appeal for me. It was simply a monumental prison, holding countless untold stories within, its ancient whispering stones. The isolation, which Papa had sought as a refuge, was quickly becoming a torment for me, a solitary boy caught in the midst of a chilling, unseen drama. I knew, with a certainty that only a child possesses, that the walls were not merely whispering. They were trying to tell me something important, something terrible. And I, Jacques, was the only one listening. The summer, which should have been a time of freedom and play, was slowly transforming into an unending vigil, a tense, waiting for the walls to reveal their deepest, darkest secrets. The obsession grew, a thorny vine choking out all other thoughts. I began to neglect my lessons, the numbers on Papa's ledgers blurring into meaningless squiggles, the historical dates of long-dead kings fading from my mind. All that mattered was the house and its secrets. I spent my days like a silent hunter, stalking the vast, dusty rooms, my ears perpetually strained, my small hands often pressed against the cold stone, trying to decipher the elusive language of the walls. It was a compulsion, stronger than any youthful fancy, a desperate need to understand what the manor was trying to convey. My explorations became more daring. I ventured into the deepest, most neglected corners, places Maman had declared off-limits due to their dilapidation. There was a narrow, winding staircase tucked away behind a tapestry in the west wing, its wooden steps groaning ominously under my weight. It led to a small, circular room at the very top of one of the manor's turrets. The room was empty, save for a thick layer of dust and a single grime-covered window that offered a sweeping, desolate view of the estate and the distant dark forests. Here the whispers were different. They weren't faint murmurs, but a cacophony, a jumbled chorus of voices that seemed to surge and ebb with the wind. It was overwhelming, like standing at the edge of a roaring sea of sound. I would retreat quickly, my head aching, my heart pounding, convinced that I was on the verge of understanding, only to have the clarity snatched away. One afternoon, while tracing the faint outlines of an ancient mural in a disused ballroom, I noticed something peculiar. Near the bottom edge of the wall, where the mural had peeled away, there was a series of shallow indentations in the plaster, almost imperceptible unless you were looking for them. They were too regular to be random decay. I ran my fingers over them, a strange prickle of anticipation rising on my skin. It felt like an ancient script, a language carved not with words, but with symbols. As I leaned closer, the whispers intensified directly from that section of the wall, an urgent, frantic thrumming. It was as if the walls were screaming, "Look! Here! Pay attention!" My mind, usually so easily distracted by thoughts of sweets or adventures, now worked with a single-minded intensity. I found a piece of charcoal from the extinguished fireplace in the grand hall and began to trace the marks onto a scrap of paper I kept in my pocket. There were curved lines, sharp angles, dots and dashes, repeated patterns that seemed to shift and combine. It was slow, painstaking work, requiring me to press my face close to the wall, inhaling the dry, musty scent of ancient plaster and dust. The whispers were loudest here, a desperate symphony that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. I spent hours trying to make sense of the symbols, drawing them again and again in my hidden corner of the library, the one place where Papa never ventured. They meant nothing to me. They resembled no alphabet I knew, no code I had ever encountered in my adventure books. Yet the whispers from the walls around them always seemed to focus on these markings, as if they were the key, the Rosetta Stone to the manor's secrets. My increasingly solitary habits did not go unnoticed, though their cause remained a mystery to my parents. Maman worried about my pallor and my quietness. "Jacques, are you ill?" she would ask, placing a cool hand on my forehead. "You look as though you've seen a ghost." I would mumble a denial, unable to articulate the strange burden I carried, the secret language I was trying to learn. Papa, preoccupied with his own troubles, merely grunted if Maman mentioned my withdrawn nature. He believed a change of scenery and the fresh country air would eventually set me right. He had no idea the scenery was actively speaking to me, Elise. However, with her childlike intuition, occasionally caught a glimpse of my obsession. One morning she found me pressing my ear against the wall in the linen closet, my eyes closed in concentration. "What are you doing, Jacques?" she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of curiosity and a touch of fear. I hesitated, then whispered, "I'm listening to the house, Elise. It whispers." She stared at me, her small face serious. What does it say? I shook my head, frustrated. I don't know. I can't understand it, but it's trying to tell me something. She reached out a tiny hand and touched the wall, her brow furrowed. It's cold, she murmured, then shrugged, her attention quickly captured by a stray thread from a stack of sheets. She didn't believe me, not truly, but at least she hadn't laughed. That was something. The marked section of the ballroom wall became my personal sanctuary, my research laboratory. I would return there daily, sometimes with a damp cloth to gently wipe away the dust, hoping to reveal more of the mysterious script. The whispers there were almost constant now, a low, urgent hum, like a bee trapped behind the plaster, but with the distinct cadence of human voices. It was no longer merely unsettling. It was profoundly sad, a mournful, drawn-out lament that filled the air. I started to perceive emotion in the indistinct sounds, a sense of anguish, of desperation, a longing for something lost. One evening, unable to sleep, I crept out of bed and stole a small oil lamp from the hall table. Clutching my charcoal rubbings, I made my way to the library, my bare feet silent on the cold stone floors. I pulled out one of Papa's ancient books, a massive tome on local folklore, filled with faded engravings. I began to flip through it, my heart thumping with a wild, improbable hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, these symbols were not unique to the Chateau Valois. Perhaps they were a forgotten language, a secret code used by the people of this valley centuries. Ego. I searched through descriptions of ancient carvings, forgotten rituals, and local superstitions. Hours passed. The lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on the high shelves. My eyes ached from the strain. Just as despair began to creep in, a faint etching caught my eye. It was small, almost hidden on the corner of a page detailing the history of a minor noble family from the region. The etching depicted a small, circular emblem, and within it, a series of lines and dots. My breath hitched. It wasn't an exact match to the symbols on the wall, but the style, the structure of the markings was eerily similar. Below the etching, faded Latin script spoke of ancient sigils of protection against unseen sorrows. Protection? Against sorrow? The words resonated with the mournful quality of the whispers. Was the house not trying to tell me a story of its past, but perhaps of its suffering? Was it trying to warn me? The thought sent a fresh wave of chills down my spine, but also a surge of determination. I was closer. I was so much closer to understanding. The walls, I realized, were not just whispering, they were pleading, and I, Jacques, would find out what for. The discovery of the ancient sigils, or at least the similar etching, was a breakthrough that ignited a new fire in me. No longer was I merely a passive listener. I was an active participant in the Manor's silent drama. The Latin phrase, sigils, of protection against unseen sorrows, echoed in my mind. If these marks were meant to protect, what sorrow had they failed to ward off? And why were the walls still lamenting? This question became the core of my quest, a riddle whispered by stone and dust. My days now revolved around that faded book and the section of the ballroom wall. I copied the ancient Latin words into my charcoal-stained notebook, attempting to decipher their full meaning with the help of a tattered Latin dictionary I found hidden behind a shelf in Papa's study. The language was difficult, filled with archaic terms and convoluted grammar, but with painstaking effort I began to piece together fragments. The book spoke of a family, the de Valois, who had owned the chateau for centuries, and a particularly tragic period in the late 17th century, marked by a series of inexplicable misfortunes and disappearances. The unseen sorrows referred to a presence, a lingering despair that had settled over the family, draining their vitality and leading to their ultimate downfall. It warned against disturbing ancient protections, implying that their removal could unleash the very forces they were meant to contain. The more I read, the more I understood the profound sadness in the whispers. They weren't just echoes of sound. They were echoes of emotion, a residual imprint of suffering that had saturated the very structure of the house. The whispers, I now believed, were the collective memory of the de Valois family, trapped within, the walls, reliving their anguish. And the symbols? They were a silent plea, a desperate attempt to communicate the source of their torment. One stormy evening, as thunder rattled the windows and rain hammered against the roof, I found myself back in the ballroom. The air was thick with static, and the whispers were almost audible, like 100 muted voices speaking just outside my hearing. I traced the symbols again, my fingers trembling. The Latin text had mentioned a specific date, a winter solstice, when the protection had supposedly been enacted. I scoured the ballroom wall, looking for any other dates, any other clues. My fingers brushed against a loose piece of plaster near the floor, almost hidden by a decorative molding. I tugged gently, and a small fragment broke away, revealing a dark, shallow cavity behind it. My heart leaped. Inside, nestled in the dust, was a tiny, tarnished silver locket. It was cold to the touch, and when I pried it open with a trembling thumb, I saw two faded miniatures. One was a beautiful woman with eyes that seemed to hold endless sorrow, the other a stern-faced man in period clothing. Below them, barely visible, were etched initials, AV and LV, and a date, 1698. This was close to the period of the unseen sorrows mentioned in the book. This locket, hidden within the very wall that whispered, was a tangible link to the past, a personal item left behind by someone who had lived and suffered in this house. The whispers around me surged, a sudden, excited rush of sound, as if the walls themselves recognized their lost treasure. I felt a profound connection to the people in the miniatures, a sudden surge of empathy for their forgotten grief. I spent the next few days with the locket, holding it, examining it under the weak sunlight. It felt strangely warm in my hand, as if it still held the faintest trace of the warmth of its previous owner. I kept it hidden under my pillow at night, a secret companion in the vast, silent manor. The whispers seemed to focus on the locket when I held it, becoming more distinct, almost pleading. The next step, I decided, was to find out who AV and LV were. The book on local folklore mentioned several generations of the de Valois family, but their individual histories were brief, mere lists of births, marriages, and deaths. There had to be more. There had to be something in the manor itself, some forgotten journal or letter that could tell me their story. My search expanded beyond the general public rooms. I began to seek out hidden compartments, false walls, and secret drawers. The manor, I reasoned, was built in an age of intrigue and hidden passages. If the previous inhabitants had suffered so greatly, perhaps they had left behind a record, a testimony to their anguish, a final desperate message. I spent hours tapping on panels, running my hands along cornices, pushing on loose bricks in the fireplace. My pursuit led me to the abandoned master bedroom, a grand yet deeply unsettling room on the second floor. The bed, draped in dust sheets, was enormous, and a large armoire stood against one wall, its dark wood carved with elaborate, forbidding motifs. This room, more than any other, felt saturated with the pervasive sorrow. The whispers here were a constant, mournful drone, so strong that I sometimes felt a physical pressure on my chest. As I examined the armoire, I noticed a slight discoloration on the back panel near the floor. It was almost invisible, but something about its unnatural flatness caught my eye. I pressed on it, pushed, pulled, until with a soft click, a small section of the panel slid inwards. Behind it, not a grand, secret passage, but a shallow, narrow space, just wide enough to hold a few slender objects. And there they were. A small, leather-bound diary, its cover cracked and faded, and a handful of yellowed letters tied with a brittle silk ribbon. My hands trembled as I pulled them out. This was it. This was what the walls had been pleading for. The air around me crackled with an unseen energy, and the whispers intensified, rising to a crescendo that was almost a keen. I recognized the initials AV etched on the diary. It was hers, the woman from the locket. With the diary clutched in my hand and the muffled, triumphant chorus of the walls around me, I knew I was on the brink of unraveling the ancient sorrow of Chateau Valois. The silence of the manor had finally broken, and its true voice, a voice from centuries past, was about to be heard. The diary, small and unassuming, felt impossibly heavy in my hands. Its leather cover, once smooth, was now brittle and flaked, the gold embossing of AV almost entirely worn away. I carried it back to my room, the oil lamp casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to whisper along with the actual walls. My heart hammered with a mixture of fear and profound excitement. This wasn't just an old book. It was a voice from the past, the very voice that the manor seemed to be desperate for me to hear. I opened the diary with reverence, the pages rustling like dry leaves. The script inside was elegant but faded, the ink bleeding slightly in places, as if written with tears. It was written in French, thankfully, though an older, more formal style than I was accustomed to. The first few entries were mundane, records of household affairs, social visits, the growth of her rose garden. But then, as I turned more pages, the tone shifted. The writer, I quickly understood, was Anne-Sophie de Valois, the woman from the locket. Her entries began to speak of a growing unease, a chill that had settled over the chateau after her marriage to Lord Laurent de Valois, LV from the locket. At first it was subtle, shadows that seemed to deepen inexplicably, objects that moved on their own accord, faint, unidentifiable sounds. She dismissed them as the quirks of an old house, the creaks and groans inherent in ancient stone. But then, her words grew more desperate. She wrote of her husband, Laurent, a man initially full of life and laughter, who slowly became withdrawn, his eyes haunted, his spirit extinguished. He began to speak of an oppressive presence, a coldness in the air that no fire could banish. He complained of incessant whispers, faint but constant, that followed him, draining his will. Anne-Sophie at first thought it was his imagination, a malady of the mind. But soon, she began to experience it too. "The air is thick with sorrow," she wrote in one entry, her hand seeming to tremble on the page. "It clings to the tapestries, seeps from the very stones. I hear them now, the whispers. They are not sounds, not truly, but a feeling, a pervasive melancholia that seeks to extinguish all joy. My own servants, once cheerful, now move like ghosts, their faces pale, their eyes vacant." She detailed how the vibrant life of the chateau slowly withered. Her rose garden, once her pride, began to droop, its blooms turning black on the stem. The animals in the stables grew sickly. The children of the estate, once lively, became listless, prone to fever and quiet, unsettling dreams. Anne-Sophie, a woman of strong faith, turned to prayer, but even that offered little solace against the insidious despair that permeated every corner of the manor. Then came the disappearances. First, a stable boy, then a scullery maid, then a distant cousin who had come to visit. They simply vanished, leaving no trace, no struggle, just an emptiness that added to the pervasive grief. The authorities were called, searches conducted, but nothing was found. Anne-Sophie wrote of the growing terror, the accusations whispered in the village that the de Valois family was cursed, that the chateau was haunted by a malevolent spirit. Lord Laurent, in his desperation, sought ancient lore. He found texts describing protective sigils against lingering sorrows, rituals that involved the carving of symbols into the very fabric of the house, imbued with the intent to ward off such unseen presences. Anne Sophie's entries spoke of his frantic efforts, his hope that these markings, etched deep into the ballroom walls and other key points, would finally repel the unseen force. But they failed, or perhaps they merely contained it. Anne Sophie's final entries were heart-wrenching. She wrote of their last child, a daughter named Marie, succumbing to a slow, debilitating illness, her vibrancy fading day by day. Anne Sophie described, the whispers growing stronger as Marie weakened, sounding like a chorus of hungry wails. The parents were helpless, watching their beloved daughter waste away, consumed by an invisible enemy. The last entry, dated 1701, was almost illegible, the script frantic, smudged with what I could only assume were tears. Marie is gone. The darkness has claimed her as it claimed all others. Laurent, he has locked himself in his study, speaking only to the whispers. I am next. I feel it. This sorrow. It is not merely a presence, but a hunger. It feeds on our grief, on our love, on our very lives. The sigils, they trapped it here. They did not banish it. They only contained it. And now it grows stronger, trapped with us. If anyone ever finds this, flee. Flee, Valois. The sorrow waits. I closed the diary, my hands shaking. The whispers around me, which had seemed so mournful before, now felt like a desperate warning, a chilling confirmation of Anne Sophie's final words. The tragedy of Valois was not just a historical event. It was an ongoing horror. The unseen sorrows were not a myth. They were a lingering, predatory force, feeding on despair, trapped within these very walls. The symbols were not just protection, they were a prison for both the de Valois family's echoes and, perhaps, for the entity itself. I looked at the locket in my palm, the faded faces of Anne Sophie and Laurent looking back at me with their endless sorrow. They hadn't just died. They had been consumed. And now my family, unknowingly, had moved into their tomb. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on me, heavy and cold. I was no longer a curious boy exploring a mysterious house. I was a reluctant, heir to a curse, burdened with a secret that could destroy us all. The Manor, I now understood, wasn't just whispering its secrets. It was begging for help. And I, Jacques, was the only one who could hear its cries. The terrifying revelations from Anne Sophie's diary weighed on me like the oppressive silence of the Manor itself. The unseen sorrow was not a mere haunting. It was a malevolent, living entity, feeding on grief, trapping its victims, and slowly consuming them. My own family, unwitting participants, were now in its grasp. The innocent whispers, which had once filled me with a childlike curiosity, now sounded like the ravenous breath of a predator, growing stronger with each passing day. My initial fear had transformed into a grim determination. I had to warn Papa and Maman. I had to make them understand. I approached Papa first, finding him in his study, surrounded by the usual sea of ledgers and papers. The flickering candlelight cast deep shadows on his weary face. He looked more tired than usual, his movements slow, his shoulders slumped. The changes in him had been subtle at first, but now they were undeniable. His once booming laugh was gone, replaced by a strained cough. His quick temper had mellowed into a pervasive listlessness. Even his once meticulous appearance had given way to unkempt hair and rumpled clothes. The sorrow, I realized with a sickening lurch in my stomach, was already working on him. "Papa," I began, my voice trembling slightly. "I need to tell you something important. It's about the house," he grunted, not looking up from his papers. "Not now, Jacques. I have important matters of finance to contend with. I pressed on, my voice rising in urgency. But it is important, Papa. It's about why we are here, and why the de Valois family left. I held up the locket and the diary, their antique surfaces glinting faintly in the dim light. I found these. They explain everything. He finally looked up, his eyes clouded with irritation. What nonsense is this, boy? Ancient trinkets and scribblings. Have you nothing better to do than fill your head with fanciful tales? He waved a dismissive hand. The de Valois family faced financial ruin, just as we do now. It's a simple matter of economics, not ghosts. His words were dismissive, yet there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a momentary tremor that spoke of his own growing unease, quickly suppressed. I tried to explain about Anne Sophie, about the children, about the disappearances, about the sorrow that fed on grief. I spoke of the sigils and how they trapped the entity, rather than repelled it. But his face remained hardened, his expression growing increasingly exasperated. Enough, Jacques. You spend too much time alone in these dusty rooms. You're becoming morbid. Go and play with Elise. This is a distraction I cannot afford. He turned back to his ledger, his shoulders set in a final dismissal. Defeated, I retreated, the diary and locket clutched tightly to my chest. He didn't believe me. He couldn't. His mind was too burdened by his own worries, too steeped in the practicalities of the world to comprehend the unseen horrors that clung to the very air he breathed. I sought out Maman next, finding her in the grand salon, attempting to clean a tarnished silver candelabra. She, too, seemed to have changed. Her usually vibrant energy was muted, her movements slower, her smile less frequent. Her eyes held a distant, melancholic look, as if she were constantly on the verge of tears she couldn't shed. The sorrow was affecting her, too, seeping into her quiet strength. Maman, I pleaded, holding out the diary. Please read this. It explains everything. The house. It's not safe. She glanced at the ancient book, then back at the candelabra, a sigh escaping her lips. Jacques, my dear, I am tired. This house is a monumental task, and your papa is so preoccupied. Perhaps later, when I have more time and strength. It's just an old diary, isn't it? A bit of history. Her words were gentle, but her dismissiveness was just as crushing as papa's. They were caught, tangled in the invisible web of the sorrow. Their minds, clouded by the pervasive melancholia, could not accept the truth. The entity, I realized, was already at work, subtly draining their spirits, making them too weary, too dispirited to believe in anything beyond their immediate, tangible struggles. It thrived on their hopelessness, on their quiet despair. The more they focused on their mundane woes, the stronger the sorrow grew. My last hope was Elise. She was young, her mind still open to magic and the unseen. I found her in her room, playing quietly with a collection of smooth river stones. I sat beside her, the diary open on my lap, and read to her Anne Sophie's story, translating the difficult passages into simpler words. I showed her the locket, the faces of the lost de Valois family. Elise listened, her eyes wide, her small hands clutching her stones. As I read the final desperate entry, a tear trickled down her cheek. "The poor little girl," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She was taken by the cold sadness. She looked up at me, her blue eyes filled with a pure, unadulterated fear that pierced my heart. "Is it here now, Jacques? The cold sadness?" "Yes, Elise," I admitted, my own voice tight with emotion. "It is, and it's making Papa and Maman sad and tired so they can't see it." She looked around the room, then at the wall behind her bed, her small face turning pale. "We have to make them leave, Jacques," she said, her voice firmer than I had ever heard it. "We have to go." A flicker of hope ignited within me. Elise believed me. She felt it too. Together, perhaps, we could find a way. If the sigils had merely contained the sorrow, then there must be a way to release it, or perhaps to truly banish it. The diary had hinted at a ritual, a specific time. Anne Sophie's final entry was a warning, but also a desperate plea for someone to understand. I had understood. Now, with Elise by my side, I felt a renewed strength. We were two against an unseen enemy, but we were two who believed. The whispers, which had once felt so threatening, now seemed almost like allies, the trapped voices of the de Valois family guiding me, urging me forward. I knew then that the next part of my quest would be to decipher the full meaning of the ancient sigils and the rituals connected to them. The answer to saving my family, I felt certain, lay within the very magic that had failed the de Valois.